Civilization has always stood on a razor's edge between freedom and impulse. Strip away our cities, our laws, our myths of order, and you will find the same animal drives that once led tribes into blood feuds and kings into ruin. The human brain is not neutral. It is wired for immediacy, for hunger, for lust, for rage. And yet, paradoxically, the highest achievement of our species is not in indulging these forces, but in learning to leash them. Self-control is not a minor virtue. It is the very engine of civilization itself. Plato captured this paradox in his image of the charioteer, the rational soul clutching the reins, struggling to steer two wild horses, one noble, one base, both tugging toward chaos. Without the charioteer, without self-mastery, the horses drag the rider into the abyss. What Plato saw in myth, modern neuroscience has confirmed in data. Civilization is nothing more than the fragile scaffolding we build to keep chaos within us at bay. Nietzsche sharpened this vision with cruelty and precision. For him, self-control was not meek denial, not the timid no of the ascetic, but the great yes of power, will forged in the fire of resistance. To command oneself is the precondition for commanding the world. Every empire, every philosophy, every invention that has bent history was born first in the quiet crucible of inner restraint. And so the question is not whether self-control matters. It is whether any human freedom can exist without it. For freedom without restraint collapses into addiction, into tyranny of desire, into a life chained by every passing impulse. We live in an age that praises freedom, yet worships indulgence. We are told to be ourselves, even as corporations spend billions to engineer our cravings and bend our attention. Is this freedom, or is it slavery in a mask? Self-control is not a prison, it is the condition for liberation. Without it, the will is scattered, the mind enslaved, the spirit devoured by its own hungers. With it, life becomes art, a form sculpted, chosen, and created. This is the paradox that has haunted every thinker from Plato to Nietzsche. The path to liberation lies not in surrender, but in mastery. And yet, before we speak of mastery, we must first confront the enemy, impulse itself. To understand the art of self-control, we must descend into the machinery of desire, into the circuits of the brain, into the psychology that drives us toward ruin. Because to conquer something, you must first look it in the eye. To understand self-control, we must strip back the mask and examine the raw machinery of the human mind. At the center of it lies dopamine, the ancient neurotransmitter that evolution designed not to reward us with pleasure, but to make us chase it endlessly. Contrary to the myths of dopamine hits, modern neuroscience reveals something darker. Dopamine does not satisfy, it enslaves. It is not the chemical of happiness, but of hunger. Each spike is not a reward, but a whisper, more, more, more. This is why instant gratification feels irresistible. Social media notifications, fast food, pornography, gambling, all engineered traps that hijack the very circuits of our survival. What once drove the hunter toward the kill now drives the consumer toward the click. The human brain, once a weapon honed for survival, has been turned against itself by algorithms tuned to exploit every weakness. Freud would have recognized this battlefield. He named the monster the id, the primal drive for sex, food, aggression. Locked in constant war with the superego, the moral overseer, the voice of civilization. Between them stands the fragile ego, a negotiator, a soldier at the border of chaos. And in the 21st century, consumer culture has allied itself with the I did. Corporations do not sell products, they sell triggers. They profit when your ego collapses. Modern psychology only sharpens this grim truth. Studies show that the brain of a person addicted to their phone lights up in the same regions as the brain of a cocaine addict. The difference? Cocaine has a dealer. The phone is in your pocket. A billion-dollar industry thrives on your inability to resist. In 2025, the average human attention span has shrunk below 9 seconds. Rats in laboratories once pressed levers until they starved, seeking dopamine rewards. Today, humans scroll until their lives vanish. But here is the hidden cruelty. The enemy is not outside, it is within. Neuroscience shows that discipline is not about silencing desire, but about rewiring the brain circuitry itself. Every impulsive act is a vote cast for the self you will become. Every indulgence strengthens the neural path of weakness. Every restraint carves a new road toward mastery. This is the real war, not one of morals, but of biology. And if we cannot see the traps, we will spend our lives as puppets pulled by chemical strings. The truth is almost unbearable. Most of us are not living, but reacting. Our choice is dictated by dopamine's hunger. And if that is true, then freedom itself is an illusion until we learn to wrest back control. Which is why the ancients must now speak. Because long before neuroscience, long before Freud, men like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius already saw the chains of desire and built the philosophy to break them. The Romans knew what we have forgotten, that freedom is not indulgence but mastery over the self. Seneca, writing in a world of emperors and excess, declared, "No man is free who is a slave to his body." To the Stoics, self-control was not deprivation but liberation, the highest form of sovereignty. Marcus Aurelius, burdened with the power of empire, confessed in his private journals that the true battle was not with Persians or Parthians, but with the whispers of his own desires, the corrosion of his own mind. For the Stoic, self-control is the art of choosing reason over impulse, the long term over the fleeting. It is not ascetic cruelty, but a radical affirmation of life. To deny oneself the poison of excess in order to taste the purity of existence itself. In this view, discipline is not a chain, but a key, the key that unlocks freedom from being ruled by every hunger and distraction. And what the ancients intuited, science now confirms. In 2025, longitudinal studies on delayed gratification reveal that individuals who can resist short-term temptation consistently report higher well-being, financial stability, and even physical health. The old marshmallow test, once dismissed as simplistic, has evolved into decades of data showing that those who master impulse in childhood often carve out stronger, more resilient lives in adulthood. Self-control predicts success more reliably than IQ or social class. The Stoics were right. Discipline is destiny. But this vision is controversial because it cuts against the grain of modern culture. We are told happiness lies in acquisition, in surrendering to appetite, in chasing every fleeting thrill. The Stoic would laugh at this insanity. For them, joy was found in restraint, in living according to nature, in the freedom that comes when the inner tyrant of desire is dethroned. And yet, even Stoicism holds its danger, because every act of restraint carries within it a shadow. If we worship control too much, if we elevate it into an idol, discipline itself becomes a prison. Seneca hinted at this tension, but Nietzsche would later drag it into the light. The peril of self-denial, the sickness that arises when control curdles into obsession, which forces us into a darker territory, the other edge of the blade. If self-control is power, what happens when that power turns inward and devours the self? Every virtue carries its poison, and self-control is no exception. To praise restraint without limit is to invite pathology, for the same force that builds empires can just as easily break the individual who worships it. What begins as discipline can rot into obsession, a mania of denial that corrodes the spirit from within. Nietzsche warned against this with ferocity. He saw in the ascetic priest, the man who denies himself food, pleasure, love, a grotesque inversion of strength. Not power, but sickness disguised as virtue. To live in constant repression is not to conquer desire, but to be consumed by it, twisting one's soul into knots of guilt and secret rage. For Nietzsche, the danger was clear. The man who kills every instinct also kills the possibility of life. Psychology offers a grim echo of this warning. The perfectionist, obsessed with control, does not thrive. He collapses under the impossible weight of his own standards. Clinical studies in 2025 show a chilling correlation between extreme self-repression and skyrocketing rates of anxiety, eating disorders, and burnout. To discipline the body and mind without compassion is to turn the will into a whip, lashing until there is nothing left to command. The tragedy is that society often mistakes this self-destruction for virtue. The corporate world glorifies the sleepless executive, the productivity addict who burns their health for the illusion of control. Fitness culture idolizes the bodybuilder whose every calorie is weighed like scripture. Even religion, at times, has sanctified suffering for its own sake. Yet beneath the surface lies pathology, control no longer in service of freedom, but of fear. This is the paradox. Without self-control, life dissolves into chaos. With too much, it calcifies into prison. The middle path, discipline tempered with humanity, is rare because extremes are easier. To indulge endlessly is simple. To repress endlessly is also simple. But to master the art of balance, to harness desire without being consumed by it, that is the rarest and most difficult of all achievements. And this balance is not merely personal. History shows that those who wield power without restraint destroy themselves and their nations, while those who obsessively repress every instinct lose their humanity. Self-control, then, is not just a private struggle, but a political weapon. The true test of a ruler, of a revolutionary, of any leader in history has been this: the ability to master appetite before appetite masters power. Which brings us to the question of power itself, how restraint and self-control define those who rise, and how their absence ensures inevitable collapse. Power is not measured by the armies one commands or the wealth one hoards. True power is revealed in the moment of restraint, the capacity to act and yet to withhold. History's greatest leaders were not those who surrendered to impulse, but those who bent their desires to the service of strategy. Julius Caesar could gamble with legions, yet he knew when to cross the Rubicon and when to wait. George Washington could have seized the throne of a new nation, yet he chose the discipline of stepping away. Their power was not in appetite, but in control of it. Machiavelli understood this brutal truth. He wrote that a ruler must be both fox and lion, cunning and fierce, but never a slave to either instinct. The prince who indulges recklessly becomes despised, while the one who calculates his passions bends fortune to his will. And centuries later, Michel Foucault exposed the flip side. Power itself is nothing more than discipline projected outward. The way a state governs its people is an echo of how individuals govern themselves. Weak rulers, addicted to their own desires, create weak nations. But the world remembers the opposite just as vividly: the ruin caused by those who lacked control. In modern politics, scandals are rarely about ideology, they are about appetite. Affairs, addictions, bribes, reckless words unleashed in moments of ego. Careers that took decades to build collapse overnight because one man, one woman, could not master the urge of a single moment. Technology has only magnified this truth. In the age of cameras and screens, the lapse of 1 second can annihilate the work of a lifetime. And yet, the psychology is the same. Leaders fail for the same reason individuals fail, because self-control was never cultivated, because willpower was mistaken for arrogance, because the reins of the charioteer slipped loose. The collapse of leaders is simply the collapse of the individual writ large. This is why power without discipline always eats itself alive. From monarchs who drowned in excess to CEOs who watched empires vanish with one impulsive act, history is littered with corpses of the undisciplined. What begins as freedom becomes indulgence. Indulgence becomes corruption. Corruption becomes collapse. But what is this mysterious force we call willpower? Can it be measured, strengthened, exhausted? Is it finite, or is it a muscle that grows with struggle? For centuries, this question belonged to philosophers. But in the past few decades, psychology and neuroscience have dragged it into the laboratory, and the answers are both shocking and controversial. That leads us into the science of willpower. For centuries, willpower was treated as a moral mystery, a matter of character or divine grace. But psychology in the late 20th century attempted to pin it down with ruthless clarity. Roy Baumeister's famous ego depletion theory claimed that self-control is like a muscle. Use it too much in one day and it grows weak, fatigued, until it collapses. This idea shook culture. Suddenly, decision fatigue explained everything from failed diets to reckless CEOs signing disastrous contracts late at night. Kahneman's research on cognitive strain lent further weight. The mind has limits, and once it is overburdened, it defaults to the easiest, laziest choice. But the science did not stand still. By the 2020s, replication crises and new experiments challenged the simplicity of ego depletion. The truth was stranger. Willpower is not a finite fuel that simply drains. It is also a belief system. If you think your will is limited, it becomes limited. If you believe it can expand, the brain recruits hidden reserves. Self-control is partly biological, partly psychological, but also ideological. In other words, what you believe about your strength shapes the strength itself. Modern neuroscience adds a darker twist. In 2025, imaging studies reveal that willpower is not located in some mystical faculty, but in the prefrontal cortex, the same fragile strip of brain that alcohol, stress, and sleep deprivation erode. Willpower collapses not because it is morally weak, but because society keeps us in states of permanent sabotage. Endless notifications, corporate deadlines, sleepless nights, dopamine-saturated screens, these are not neutral. They are weapons designed to drain the very organ responsible for resistance. Even more shocking are the new experiments on habit formation. Researchers find that willpower alone cannot sustain long-term change. Habits automate self-control by bypassing decision fatigue altogether. When the brain builds a ritual, waking at dawn, exercising without debate, refusing sugar as a default, it removes the need for choice. Choice is fragile. Habit is armor. The disciplined are not superhuman. They are architects of environments where temptation simply never reaches them. This is the new frontier. Willpower is not merely a force you exert, it is a system you design. The weak man thinks he must fight temptation endlessly. The wise man restructures his life so that the battle never occurs. In this way, self-control is less about strength and more about strategy. And here lies the seed of rebellion. Because in a world engineered to scatter your focus, every act of self-control becomes an act of defiance. Discipline itself becomes political, even revolutionary. We live in an empire of distraction. Corporations have colonized our attention. Governments have weaponized outrage, and algorithms have perfected the art of making us slaves who believe themselves free. In this landscape, the act of self-control is no longer just a personal virtue, it is a radical act of rebellion. To discipline yourself today is to resist a machine designed to keep you weak. Kierkegaard once wrote that the greatest despair is to live without becoming yourself. What could be more relevant in 2025? Every scroll, every advertisement, every dopamine-triggering device is an invitation to live as someone else's consumer, someone else's data point, someone else's puppet. Self-control, the refusal to indulge every impulse, the choice to delay gratification, is the refusal to be programmed. It is authenticity in the Kierkegaardian sense, the decision to choose yourself instead of being chosen by the crowd. Sartre sharpened this into something harsher. Freedom is not given, it is condemned. You are condemned to be free, which means you cannot hide behind instinct, culture, or biology. To surrender to impulse is to abdicate freedom. To master impulse is to bear its weight. And in an age where consumer capitalism thrives on distraction, the individual who resists becomes a threat. Discipline is not conformity, it is heresy. Look around. Society wants you addicted. Social media companies engineer apps to be unescapable. Food corporations lace products with sugar and fat to keep you consuming. Politicians thrive on your outrage because a distracted, impulsive citizenry cannot rebel. What then is the most dangerous thing you can do? Not to riot, not to shout, but to quietly take control of yourself. To read when others scroll, to save when others spend. To speak only when the words are chosen, not triggered. This is why true discipline feels so alien, because it is revolutionary. It defies the architecture of modern life. To master oneself is to step outside the system designed to master you. And that is why, paradoxically, the one who controls himself may be the freest revolutionary alive. Yet rebellion is not only political or philosophical, it also touches the deepest realm of human existence, the spiritual. Because self-control is not just resistance to external control, it is transcendence of the ego itself. The West has long framed self-control as a battle of will, man against desire, reason against impulse. But in the East, the lens was different. Buddhism, Taoism, Hindu traditions, they did not demand war against the self, but dissolution of the self's illusions. To master desire was not to strangle it, but to see through it. The Buddha taught that craving, tanha, is the root of suffering. Liberation does not come from indulging or repressing desire, but from recognizing its impermanence. The man who craves is chained to the wheel of suffering. The man who sees craving as illusion steps off the wheel entirely. Taoism whispers the same paradox. Control is found not in forcing, but in flowing, not in domination, but in alignment with the way. Where the West builds walls of discipline, the East dissolves the very need for walls. Modern psychology has remarkably circled back to these insights. In 2025, clinical studies on mindfulness and meditation show profound effects on impulse control, addiction recovery, even physical health. Functional MRI scans reveal that meditation strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the same seat of self-regulation, the Stoics spoke of as the citadel of reason. By cultivating awareness, the meditator does not fight impulses, he observes them until they dissolve. Neuroscience now confirms what monks intuited: attention is the lever that moves desire. But here lies the philosophical shock. Self-control is not merely a tool of survival or power. It is a spiritual technology, a means of transcending the ego itself. The Stoic seeks to rule himself. The Buddhist seeks to see that there was no ruler in the first place. Both, however, arrive at freedom. And perhaps this is the highest form of self-control, not to deny yourself endlessly, nor to indulge endlessly, but to step beyond the game altogether, to see impulse, ego, craving, and power as passing shadows. The individual who achieves this no longer struggles against himself, he simply is. Yet the danger remains. Civilizations are not built in monasteries. Societies that abandon restraint in the collective, even as individuals seek transcendence, collapse into chaos. History has already carved this warning into stone. And in our own age of indulgence, we may be walking toward the same precipice. Which leads us into the question no one wants to face. What happens to societies when self-control collapses? History has already answered the question of what happens when restraint dissolves. Civilizations do not collapse because they are conquered. They collapse because they rot from within. Rome is the archetype. Its early republic was built on discipline. Farmers who became soldiers, soldiers who became statesmen, citizens who saw moderation as strength. But as wealth poured in, restraint withered. Bread and circuses replaced duty, decadence replaced discipline, and Rome devoured itself long before the barbarians arrived at the gates. The Weimar Republic offers a more modern echo. In the 1920s, Germany drowned itself in nihilism, decadence in the clubs, hyperinflation in the streets, citizens chasing every indulgence as the social fabric disintegrated. When self-control collapses, freedom does not flourish. Instead, chaos opens the door for tyranny. Out of indulgence came desperation. Out of desperation came dictatorship. And now, in 2025, the same symptoms are visible on a planetary scale. Social media addiction has shattered collective attention. Citizens gorge on outrage, unable to resist the next headline, the next viral clip. Political movements no longer debate, they react. Impulsive mobs guided not by reason, but by dopamine spikes of tribal rage. Consumer culture has reached absurd extremes. Debt spirals as people buy not what they need, but what they cannot resist. A society that cannot delay gratification mortgages its future for the thrill of the moment. The philosopher Oswald Spengler warned that civilizations die not from external attack, but from internal exhaustion, from the triumph of appetite over restraint. Today, it is not hard to see the signs. Endless distraction, fractured communities, a generation drowning in compulsions disguised as freedom. We call it liberty, but it is chains, chains forged by our own hands. The warning is clear. Without self-control, freedom itself dies. For when no one governs themselves, someone else must govern them. Chaos demands order, and order arrives wearing the mask of tyranny. The collapse of restraint is not the birth of freedom, but its execution. And so we return to the paradox with which we began. Self-control is not limitation, but liberation. To master oneself is to preserve freedom, not just for the individual, but for the world they inhabit. Without it, we are Rome in decline, Weimar in collapse, a civilization of addicts marching blindly into its grave. Which leaves us with the final revelation, the paradox of liberation itself. How restraint, far from being the enemy of freedom, is its deepest expression. Here lies the final paradox. Freedom is not the absence of restraint, but the artful practice of it. A man who indulges every impulse is not free, he is a slave, dragged from one craving to the next. A society that mistakes consumption for liberty eventually discovers that it has mortgaged its very soul. But the one who disciplines himself, who chooses when to say yes and when to say no, who masters the appetites instead of being mastered, he is the only one who can truly call himself free. Plato saw it in the image of the charioteer, Nietzsche in the will to power, Seneca in the wisdom of moderation. And now neuroscience, psychology, and modern data only confirm what the philosophers intuited. Self-control is the condition for human dignity. Without it, the individual collapses into addiction, and civilizations collapse into tyranny. With it, both individual and civilization carve out space for greatness. But the paradox deepens. Restraint is not meant to be a prison. It is not endless repression, not joyless austerity. True self-control is closer to art than to law. The painter limits himself to a canvas and creates infinity. The musician submits to rhythm and discovers eternity. In the same way, the individual who limits his impulses does not lose life. He discovers it. For freedom without form is chaos. Form is the birth of meaning. This is why Kierkegaard spoke of the courage to be oneself, why Sartre saw freedom as responsibility, why the Buddha dissolved the illusion of craving altogether. Each, in their own way, pointed toward the same revelation. To master the self is to transcend it. To govern your impulses is to open the possibility of something higher than impulse. And so, in an age of distraction, outrage, and consumer slavery, the call is simple but brutal. Reclaim yourself. Do not mistake indulgence for liberty. Do not surrender to the empire of dopamine. Do not let civilization collapse within your own skin. Master yourself, not to strangle life, but to sculpt it. Not to deny freedom, but to protect it. Because in the end, freedom and control are not enemies. They are two sides of the same truth. Only through restraint does liberty endure. And only in the art of self-control can a human being become what they truly are, a creator, not a puppet, a master, not a slave.